For a long time, Keir Starmer has carried a very specific label in British politics. Careful, cautious, almost courtroom-like in the way he weighs every argument. The kind of prime minister who looks more comfortable building a case than making a big, risky geopolitical call. But the escalating crisis involving Iran may have created something unusual for him, a moment where holding back and drawing lines starts to look like decisive leadership rather than hesitation. Inside Westminster, some senior Labour voices are already whispering that this could change how people see him. Emily Thornberry, who chairs Labour's Foreign Affairs Committee, has suggested this episode could end up being defining. And her point is pretty straightforward. Britain does not often say no when Washington asks for military cooperation, especially not when it involves the use of British bases. So when Starmer refused an American request to use UK bases to launch initial offensive strikes on Iran, it landed as more than a technical decision. In Labour circles, it's being described as a rare act of independence in the modern U.S.-UK relationship, the sort of thing people usually talk about in historical terms, not day-to-day politics. Now, it wasn't a clean break with the United States. This wasn't Starmer trying to go it alone or pick a public fight with the White House. What he's tried to build instead is a highly specific middle road, and the distinction matters. The government's line, in essence, has been, no, you can't use British bases for offensive action, but yes, we will support defensive operations aimed at intercepting or responding to Iranian missile threats. That might sound like splitting hairs, but politically it's a very deliberate line-drawing exercise. It lets Starmer argue that Britain is still serious about defense and deterrence, while also signaling that the UK is not going to slide into another Middle Eastern war by default. And if you listen to the mood of the country, you can understand why that might be the calculation. Polling suggests the public is, at best, deeply wary of military action. One survey found around 6 in 10 Britons oppose the strikes, with only about a quarter in support. Given that British politics is still haunted by the aftershocks of Iraq and Afghanistan, that skepticism isn't exactly shocking. The memory of limited interventions turning into long, costly entanglements is never far away. One Labour MP even framed the whole thing as a reveal, as if the crisis brought out a truer version of Starmer. The comparison they reached for was loaded with party history, closer to Robin Cook than Tony Blair. In other words, more aligned with the Labour tradition that questioned the Iraq war than the leadership that drove into it. For Labour people, that's not just a personality comparison. It's an identity statement. If Starmer has managed to land on a cautious equilibrium, the political right, interestingly, has struggled to find a stable line. At the start of the conflict, you heard tougher language. Support the Americans and Israelis. Stand by allies. Do more. Nigel Farage pushed in that direction. Kemi Badenoch, too, was heard urging greater support for allies. But as the conflict dragged on and as the consequences started to be felt more directly at home, the message began to wobble. Petrol prices are one of those brutally simple political signals. People may not follow the details of foreign policy, but they notice fuel costs immediately. And as costs rose and public opposition hardened, the rhetoric softened. Farage pivoted to consumer-friendly campaigning, turning up with a promise of cheaper fuel, while also warning against Britain being pulled into another foreign war. Badenoch insisted that she hadn't backed offensive British involvement at all, only defensive steps. And behind the scenes, even some conservative figures have admitted their communications look messy and inconsistent. Still, inside conservative circles, there's a firm belief that Starmer's refusal was strategically wrong. Former Deputy Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell has argued that when the United States asks, especially on something this serious, the default should be yes, because the alliance is central to Britain's security and influence. He also attacked Starmer's style, accusing him of leaning too heavily on legal advice and not enough on political judgment, painting him as a lawyer making a technical call rather than a leader making a strategic one. And that gets to the heart of the debate. What is leadership in a crisis like this? Is it saying yes to your closest ally to preserve trust and access? Or is it setting limits, even if it causes friction, because your country's interests and public mood demand it? There is an easy answer, and in foreign policy, the right answer often isn't clear for years. But politics doesn't wait for historians. In the short term, governments live and die by economic fallout. If conflict in the Middle East disrupts energy markets, voters feel it immediately, not in abstract geopolitics, but in everyday budgets. Labor strategists seem to believe their stance offers a kind of political insulation. If prices spike, they can argue they avoided direct involvement precisely to prevent escalation and protect the country from getting dragged deeper into instability. There's a blunt logic to that. Distance from war becomes a form of insurance. You can't control global markets, but you can control whether you help widen a conflict, and you can certainly control whether you look complicit in something unpopular when the bills arrive. For Nigel Farage, the situation carries a different kind of risk. Reform UK has been trying to present itself as a serious conservative force, not just a protest movement. And part of that repositioning has meant sounding more conventionally pro-American and, at times, more hawkish than the old UKIP brand of isolationism. But Donald Trump being back in the White House complicates that strategy. Analysts have suggested Reform misread the early phase of this confrontation, assuming it would blow over quickly and not dominate British politics. Instead, it turned into the kind of extended international crisis that reaches straight into domestic life through prices and uncertainty. There's also a deeper ideological problem. Trump campaigned with an instinctively isolationist tone, promising to avoid foreign wars. Yet the actions of his administration toward Iran look far more interventionist. That leaves pro-Trump politicians outside the U.S. in an awkward spot. How do you align yourself with a leader whose brand is no more wars, when the reality on the ground looks like escalation? And even within Starmer's own government, things aren't perfectly settled. A reported leak from a National Security Council discussion suggested several senior ministers backed blocking the American request. But there are also voices in cabinet who worry about the long-term consequences, especially the possibility of damaging trust with Washington and weakening Britain's strategic position over time. Supporters of Starmer's move argue that this is simply what alliances look like in the real world. Close partners disagree. They negotiate. They fight their corner. Emily Thornberry's view is basically that the U.S.-UK relationship is robust enough to survive a serious disagreement, and she reaches for a historical parallel. The alliance got through Vietnam, so it can get through this too. So, is this a defining moment for Keir Starmer? It might be, not because everything is resolved, and not because the consequences are known, but because perception has shifted. A prime minister often criticized for caution has shown he's prepared, at least in this case, to tell Washington no, and to do it in public terms that draw a moral and strategic line between defense and offense. In British politics, that kind of refusal doesn't happen often, and it rarely comes without a price. Sometimes the price is damage. Sometimes it's definition. And in this particular crisis, it may turn out to be both.